everyone. Welcome to the Strand Group, the signature seminar series of the Policy Institute at King's College London. I'm the director, John Davis. Before we begin, as always, a very big thank you to our friends at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, without which these things simply wouldn't happen. As you know, I'm not accustomed to making long speeches, well, apart from when Tony Blair came, but that was a different matter. But I'm not going to make an exception tonight. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce what I consider, if you follow him on Twitter, the hardest working ambassador on the circuit, the Ambassador of Ireland to the UK, Daniel Mulhall, who is going to talk about the UK, Ireland and Europe, a productive partnership. We didn't know if there was a question mark at the end.
No question.
Daniel, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John, for the invitation. John and I have met quite a few times, mainly at party conferences where John is willing to mix with dubious characters from embassies, including our own. And thank you very much for inviting me to your splendid college here, which is John showed me the chapel upstairs, and it's certainly very impressive. My own university in Cork, which was one of the godless colleges founded in the 1840s in Ireland, has a fine chapel, but I think it would struggle against the church upstairs. So thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for being here this evening on a warm and humid London evening. What I want to talk about this evening really is what I call the productive triangle: Ireland, the UK and the EU. And I suppose I want to make an argument, which is that EU membership has done many things, of course, in Europe. It has brought former enemies together into a productive partnership. But in our case, it has actually helped us in Britain and Ireland to develop a more mature and mutually beneficial relationship. And that's one of the reasons why I hope that Britain will, on the 23rd of June, vote to remain a member of the European Union. Now, when I was studying history in Cork, that godless college, the kind of college that King's was founded to counteract here in London, that was in the 1970s, by which time its godlessness had become a thing of the past. But the study of history in those days, Irish history, and probably still the case, was essentially a study of the Anglo-Irish problem. Everything that I looked at during my history studies had to do with Anglo-Irish relations, and it was never a particularly happy connection. So my studies were mainly in 19th and 20th century Irish history, and of course it was a story of the struggle of nationalist Ireland to overturn the Act of Union of 1900, mainly through parliamentary agitation led by Daniel O'Connell in the 1820s, 30s and 40s. And by the way, it's interesting that this college was founded by, or at least one of the founders of the college was Duke of Wellington, who of course locked horns with O'Connell in the battle for Catholic emancipation. But eventually Wellington became convinced that for the good order and for the peace and tranquility of these islands, and especially for the peace and tranquility of Ireland, Catholic emancipation had to be granted. So he is, in a sense, along with O'Connell, a person that eventually delivered Catholic emancipation, which was the first great reform of the British Parliament, followed shortly afterwards by the Great Reform Act of 1832. So anyway, the whole of the 19th century was all about the struggle between Westminster and various Irish politicians who sought to restore the old 18th century Irish Parliament. And that went on into the 20th century. Now, even after we became independent in 1922, Anglo-Irish relations remained a rather contested domain. In other words, independence didn't mean that everything between Britain and Ireland was hunky-dory from then on. Certainly not, because 1920s there was the Boundary Commission, which caused a lot of angst between the two countries. Eventually the borders in Ireland were established and remained unchanged ever since. And of course, in the 1930s there was an economic war between the two countries where each country slapped tariffs on the other country and of course retaliated against those tariffs. So we had a tariff war between the two countries, all triggered by a row over the payment of land annuities, which the Irish government didn't want to do. And then in the 1950s, indeed, the Irish government conducted an international campaign against the partition of Ireland. So in other words, there was a kind of a propaganda war being conducted by the Irish government against the British government in the 1950s, as late as the 1950s. But actually, the most important development of the 1950s was not that propaganda war I mentioned against partition, which was a kind of the last sort of vestiges of that sort of post-independence effort to try and complete the independence of Ireland and to try and deal with the problems created by partition and the situation in Northern Ireland, which at that time was quite peaceful, but nonetheless. So in the 1950s, the Irish government took a decision to open up our economy. And that, of course, paved the way for Ireland to join the European, what was then the European Communities, now the European Union, in 1973, together with Britain. By the way, just an interesting sidebar is that in 1959, the then Irish Taoiseach, Sean Lemass, who had fought in the Easter Rising of 1916, but by 1959 was an arch moderniser and wanted to open Ireland out to the world and wanted to get rid of protectionism and bring in foreign investment. And he's the father, really, of the modern Irish economy. But Sean Lemass came to London in 1959 and he offered full tariff-free access for all British manufactured goods into Ireland in return for full tariff-free access for Irish agriculture products into the British market. And the British government turned it down because they felt it would give too much advantage to Ireland and not enough to Britain. There's a lesson there about free trade agreements. They're not benign things. They are dog-eat-dog, where both sides try to maximise their benefit and eat the lunch of the other country. That's the reality of free trade agreements. Eventually, you arrive at a situation where both sides are satisfied with the outcome. But I just make that point because it's an interesting illustration from our history that you would think that Ireland would have been able to negotiate a free trade agreement with Britain in the 1950s when the Irish economy was so weak. But no, even then, the British government did not want to give Irish agricultural products full tariff-free access to the British market. Now, in my view, EU membership in 1973 was a game changer for Ireland and for British-Irish relations. Now that might seem surprising because clearly we didn't join the European Union in order to resolve the age-old problems of Anglo-Irish, or we now call them British-Irish relations. But I want to argue that a triangle developed between Ireland, the UK and the European Union, and I want to suggest that our relationship with our nearest neighbour has benefited immensely from the fact that we have both been members of the European Union since 1973. And this leads me to conclude that UK membership of the European Union is important to Ireland as well as to the rest of the European Union. In fact, arguably, Ireland is the country that will be most affected, other than the UK, by UK exit from the European Union. And that's why we feel we cannot afford to maintain a silence on this issue. That is why our government has already been quite vocal on this subject. Sensitive, of course, and always recognise that this is a matter for decision by the British electorate. But nonetheless, as a neighbouring country, we would be remiss if we did not put the hand on the shoulder of our nearest neighbour and say, by the way, would you like to bear these points in mind, which you mightn't have thought of, but which might be relevant to your consideration of this important decision that you are about to make on the 23rd of June. So we do not have a say in this referendum, but we do have a view. And I think it's important for us to express that view, as I'm doing now, as I have been doing for the last 6 months to a year, as I will be doing for the next 7 weeks. Of course, it's also true that the Irish community in Britain, Irish citizens here, and British people resident in Ireland will also have a vote on the 23rd of June. And that in Northern Ireland, with an electorate of 1.2 million, possibly up to half or 40% of that electorate would probably consider themselves to be Irish in some form or other. So we do have an important stake in this, not just in the relationship that we've developed over the past 40 years, but in the fact that so many Irish people will be involved in what I think will be a watershed moment for our two countries, their relationship, and for the European Union as a whole. Let me just tell you that there's one fact that I came across recently. I'm not much into offering statistics and so forth, because I think it can be confusing for an audience when I don't have a big PowerPoint to entertain you. But one fact sums up the economics of Irish independence before we joined the European Union. And that is that in 1960, almost 4 decades after Irish independence, 74% of Ireland's exports came to the UK. Now that is a figure that is practically inconsistent with political sovereignty. How can you have a situation where a country is sovereign and yet is dependent to the tune of 74% of its exports going to one country, dependent on Britain to that extent? Scarcely consistent with proper sovereignty, which is why Irish people, I think, have a different view of sovereignty from ones that might prevail elsewhere. So that means that in 1972, when we joined the European Union, effectively, once Britain decided to join, there was no sensible option for Ireland other than to join as well. Even had we been opposed to the idea of EU integration, EU membership, there would have been no realistic prospect of us taking a different course from the one that Britain took. And I know that our partners at the time in the 60s, when they were negotiating with Britain, just sort of saw Ireland as kind of a country that came along, if you like, as part of the bar. Of course, we had separate negotiations, but given the nature of our relationship with Britain at that time, in practical reality, we had very little option but to follow Britain's lead and to join the European Union. Now, it so happened that Irish politicians at that time also saw the possibilities of membership, that it could help to reduce our dependence on the British market. And there was a genuine enthusiasm for EU membership, possibly a bit different from what prevailed here in Britain, where I think the attitude to EU membership was a bit, had a different backdrop to it, had a different set of influences operating upon it. But Sean Lemass, I mentioned earlier, the father of the modern Irish economy, said in one of his speeches in the early 60s, Ireland belongs to Europe by history, tradition, and sentiment, no less than geography. Our people have always tended to look to Europe for inspiration, guidance, and encouragement. And that was true because throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, there was always a sense of Ireland trying to moderate its relationship with the UK by seeking allies, seeking support from the European powers that might have had an interest in challenging the British position at that time. So there was always this sense of Ireland looking to Europe as a source of support for our national struggle. It never came to very much, of course, but there was always that idea of European support for Irish interests. Interestingly, on the issue of sovereignty, which I know is now a vexed question in the British debate, the Irish White Paper on EU membership in 1972 tackled the sovereignty issue head on. And I quote, "There is no form of cooperation between nations that does not involve, for them, some limitations on their freedom of action. Countries willingly accept such limitations where they consider that their interests are being served by participation in the international cooperation involved. Ireland is no exception." So there you have it, in the 70s. My predecessors in the Department of Foreign Affairs, writing that white paper for the government, came up with that analysis of sovereignty, which I think is interesting because I sometimes feel in the debate here in Britain that there's a kind of an attitude towards sovereignty that it's some kind of thing that you can keep in pristine condition, that if it's ever touched, it disappears. In fact, the reality of sovereignty is that you can, by willingly deciding to coalesce with other countries, you can actually enhance your effective sovereignty, your interests. And for example, Britain sees considerable sovereignty within NATO, where the NATO obligations, and I assume these are entered into and taken deadly seriously by this country, do involve a commitment to do things that you might not wish to do in certain circumstances, but there's a commitment there. So, in other words, any international engagement does involve some kind of sharing of sovereignty. We've always been comfortable with that, and but I do see that as an issue that crops up in debate all the time here. So I would say that EU membership has been a very positive experience for Ireland. The most obvious impact, of course, has been in the economic sphere, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the impact has gone well beyond that. And one of our historians has written that EU membership had a galvanizing effect on Ireland's social and economic development. And one of the things most often cited is the equal pay legislation, which was brought in the 1970s as a direct result of our obligations within the European Union, under European legislation. So that's an example of where something that obviously would have come eventually, but it came much more rapidly to a society like ours. At the time, I remember the arguments, we can't afford this, it's too costly. But European obligations required the government to do it, and that was a very good thing, clearly. So you don't have any of the tradition in Ireland of resentment of European legislation. There tends to be a general acceptance of the fact that Europe has been a positive force in Ireland's development. Now, the killer fact about the economic impact of membership on Ireland is that when we joined the European Union in 1972, our per capita GDP was 60% of the European average. So we were by far the poorest country in the European Union. We were the only country that was significantly behind the rest of the member states in the level of our development. I looked at a table there from the 1970s recently, which measured 12 elements of economic performance, economic and social performance. And Ireland at that time was the worst performer in 10 of those 12 categories. So you can see from that that we were way behind the pace. In fact, at that time, in the early 70s, our GDP per capita was only a little over a third of the GDP per capita of the wealthiest country in the Union, Luxembourg. And that is the extent to which our economy was trailing the other European countries. We'd lost out very badly in the 1950s. When Europe boomed, we didn't. We actually went backwards at that time, and we've been catching up really since the 50s, but certainly have managed to catch up comprehensively over the past 15 years. And despite the ravages of the recent economic and financial crisis, our GDP per capita now is significantly above the European average. And even though Ireland's GDP is slightly misleading because of the impact of the foreign-owned sector on the Irish economy, nonetheless, the fact is quite clear. If you move from 60% of the European average to 115% in 40 years, that is an undeniable argument for European Union membership. And that's the reason why I think there's a sustained, highly positive public attitude towards EU membership, even though we sometimes have difficulty in ratifying European treaties. But nonetheless, if you look at the Eurostat figures, we're somewhere in the 80s when it comes to appreciation, the public appreciation of EU membership in Ireland is somewhere in the 80% territory. Now, what about the impact of membership on Britain and Ireland? As I said, we joined on the same day in 1973. At that time, our two governments were at odds with each other about Northern Ireland. Seriously at odds, actually. That was the early stages of the Troubles. Paddy Hillery, who was the Irish Foreign Minister when the Troubles started in 1969, decent man, commissioner after he stepped down as Foreign Minister, and then President of Ireland for 14 years. I actually played golf with him many times during his latter years in Dublin when I was posted there as EU director. I got to know him and we played golf together at Portmarnock Golf Club. And we had long chats walking around that wonderful golf course on the shores of Dublin Bay. And he gave me a copy of his biography. Well, it was an official biography that was written by an academic, but with a strong input from Paddy Hillery. And Paddy recounts in that book when he came to London in 1969 for discussions about the crisis in Northern Ireland. People were being killed. There was huge upheaval in Northern Ireland, and there was pressure on the Irish government to intervene in Northern Ireland. And Paddy Hillery was among those trying to calm things down and trying to find diplomatic ways of dealing with this crisis. He came to London, and the then Foreign Secretary, Michael Stewart, wouldn't see him. The then Home Secretary, Jim Callaghan, wouldn't see him. He got to see a Minister of State in the Foreign Office, Lord Chalfont. It was apparently a very difficult meeting. And Chalfont said to him that he could not consult with a member of a foreign government on developments in Northern Ireland because these were, quote unquote, a domestic affair. That was the nature of the relationship in those days. And the upshot was that Ireland took the issue of Northern Ireland to the UN and insisted on being heard at the Security Council and then in the General Assembly. So, in other words, Northern Ireland had become an issue of international contention between the two countries. It took a long time for an agreed approach which recognised the special character of Northern Ireland and the need for an agreed solution that all parties in the two governments could subscribe to. And it's probably no coincidence that the first breaking of the ice between the two governments took place with the negotiation of the Sunningdale Agreement in December 1973, a year after the two countries joined what is now the European Union together on the 1st of January 1973. Now, the EU has provided a very productive framework within which a more accommodating, mature relationship could be developed. the kind of discussion that took place between Paddy Hillary and Lord Chalfont in the summer of 1969 would be unthinkable today, where the two governments work hand in hand and in close cooperation on the issues connected with Northern Ireland, at the moment especially in dealing with the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland. And I would say that membership of the European Union helped to transform relations between our two countries. Prior to accession, the relationship was asymmetric because you had a very large country and a small neighbour. And that always leads to awkwardnesses. For Ireland, of course, Anglo-Irish relations were an overwhelming, commanding priority. Nothing else counted. But for Britain, Ireland was just one of the many things it had to deal with, and Britain had much wider horizons then as now. So the relationship was somewhat unsatisfactory, I would say, because our trade relations were governed by an Anglo-Irish free trade agreement, which was dominated, of course, by the bigger country, and indeed you had a situation where Ireland's monetary policy was decided by the Bank of England. So, for example, in those days, when the interest rate in the sterling area changed, or the currency was devalued or revalued, the Irish Central Bank would get a call about 5 minutes later saying, by the way, your interest rate has gone up or down, or the value of your currency has gone up or down. I'm not saying that today we have a commanding influence over monetary policy in Frankfurt, but at least we have a seat on the table. And that's a much more satisfactory way to conduct relations between two sovereign states, two mature democracies. Now, one of the spin-offs of EU membership has been a diversification of Irish trade with our partners, including the UK. Now, it's still the case that 40% of Ireland's food and drinks exports come to the UK. So you'll all be able to find Irish food and drink in every supermarket and in many restaurants happily around this country. But the difference is that while in the 1970s, food and drink exports from Ireland represented probably 80% of our exports to the UK. Today, food and drink exports, while they're much larger now, way, way larger than they were then, but they represent only a fraction, a small fraction of our trade, which is now dominated by manufactured goods and by services, in which both economies happen to be very strong. So it's also the case that Ireland's economic development benefited hugely from the establishment of the European single market in the early 1990s. It's very telling to look at the facts. As I said, in 1973, our GDP per capita was about 60% of the European average. By the early 90s, it was still only 70%. So we made some progress. But in those days, Gareth Fitzgerald, who was then retired from politics but was still very active in public life and a great commentator on economic and social and European policy issues, Gareth reckoned that it would take us nearly 50 years to catch up with the European average because we were making such slow progress at that time. And yet, because of the single market, Ireland's economy boomed throughout the 90s, from the mid-90s onwards, until 2008, when the recent crisis struck us. And that's when our economy was transformed. And that's why, when I hear people say, as I now do on the Leave side, that they intend to leave the single market, I worry about the implications of that knowing how much of a difference the single market made to the Irish economy and to the prosperity and well-being of our people during that 15 years between 1992 and 2007. Now, reflecting on the impact of EU membership on Irish-UK relations during his time as Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd put it very well in a speech he gave in Dublin in 1994 when he said, quote, "Britain and Ireland joined the community together because of a sense of our place in history. For the British, it was about finding a new place in the world after 2 centuries of imperial experience." It was, he said, and he reflected on the Irish rationale as he saw it for EU membership, which I think he got spot on. He was obviously well advised. He said that Irish membership was about, quote, "confirming Ireland's position as a modern state in Europe and its decisive shift away from the embrace of Britain." In fact, I would argue that EU membership has not led to a shift away from the embrace of Britain, but it's actually led to a more mature embrace by our two countries of each other, to the mutual advantage of both countries, respecting our differences while nurturing carefully the affinities that exist between us. Being partners in Europe has helped us to understand how much we have in common. We tend to see eye to eye on a wide range of EU issues. Every day in Brussels there are about 25 meetings at all levels. At each of these, Irish and UK officials will meet, discuss, compare notes and cooperate. And that network, that intense interlocking of our two public services, it'll never become headline news, but it's a very beneficial thing. Just as it's beneficial for British diplomats to meet French officials and German officials, and for us to meet a range of officials from different parts of Europe. And to lose that would, I think, be something very unfortunate, something to be avoided. So, we are allies together in a range of areas. We take part together in several like-minded groups on the digital economy, on the services sector, on climate change, where we and other countries come together to push an agenda that benefits our view of how these topics should be developed. We've both been champions of the single market because we've both benefited from that development, as I mentioned. We both favour smart regulation, something the British government has pioneered within the European Union, but with strong support from Ireland and others. We are allies in advocating the advantages of free trade, because both of us benefit greatly from a free trade environment. Our economies are very different, are very similar in profile and structure, although of course different in scale. We have worked together to shape the EU in directions conducive to our respective interconnected interests. And there is much that remains to be done. Ireland and the UK are as one in wanting to see the completion of the single market for services and in our desire to see the potential of the digital economy being fully realised at European Union level. I often ask the question, why is it that all of the major companies born on the internet were all born in the USA? How come none of them were born in Europe? The reason is that Europe doesn't have a single market in these sectors. It's only by having a single market in that area that we will be able to develop the potential of our economies in a services-driven economic environment of the future. Another good example of how we see eye to eye is the fact that Ireland was probably the leading supporter of the UK when it came to Prime Minister Cameron's negotiation of the package, the reform package agreed in February of this year as a prelude to the referendum in this country. Membership has been very good for our trading relationship across the Irish Sea. While the UK has declined dramatically in its relative importance as a market for Irish exports, the scale of those exports has increased exponentially. And last year, between us, we traded goods and services to the value of 65 billion euros. Yes, that's billion with a B. And that means that every week of the year last year, more than £1 billion was traded across that narrow stretch of water that separates our two countries, our two islands. Now, I'm not an alarmist, and I'm not suggesting that trade between Britain and Ireland will come to an end in the event of a Brexit. But it can hardly be surprising that we in Ireland look with a degree of trepidation on the possibility of the UK leaving the single market. We don't know for sure what the implications of such a move would be for trade as well as for other things, but we do know that it cannot be positive. There's nobody suggesting that trade between the UK and other European countries will actually increase in the event of the UK leaving the single market. No one in their right mind would suggest that British-Irish trade can benefit or can increase in volume if Britain is outside the European Union, and Ireland, of course, will continue to be a member of that union. Now, our Economic and Research Institute has recently produced an analysis of the situation, which suggests that there could be a reduction of 20% or more in Irish-UK trade. Now, even if that reduction were to be between, say, 5 and 10%, that still amounts to a loss to both economies of between 3.25 billion euros, 3.25 billion euros, to 6.5 billion, 6.5 billion. Now, those are not as large as the sums that perhaps might attract headlines, but think of it. Even if you go for the very low impact on trade of 5%, 3.25 billion euros is a significant quantity of trade. Plus, we lose out on all the potential for the further growth of trade, especially in the event of us succeeding in completing the single market for services. Now, the trading relationship will depend on the new agreement that will be put together, presumably, between the UK and the EU in the event of a UK exit. What's clear to me is that it's not credible to believe that the UK could leave the European Union and still enjoy exactly the same rights and access as a non-member state as it currently enjoys as a member of the European Union. If you leave a club, there are bound to be disadvantages to that departure from the European Union. And this would be unfortunate, especially for Ireland and for British-Irish relations in the trade field. EU membership has had, I believe, a very beneficial effect on Northern Ireland, where the EU has been a source of encouragement and financial support. Northern Ireland received significant benefit from the common agricultural policy, from the structural funds, from the peace programme, which is designed to support the peace process in Northern Ireland, and indeed from the Interreg programme, which promotes North-South cooperation. EU membership has, I think, also helped to soften the identity clash in Northern Ireland. So I would say that people in Northern Ireland, nationalists in Northern Ireland, would see EU membership as giving them a connection with their fellow Irish people south of the border. And this helps to accommodate them to the reality that they live within the UK Union, a union that they ideally probably would have preferred not to be part of. So I think that membership of the EU has had an important influence in softening somewhat the clash of identities. It's at the heart of the situation in Northern Ireland. North-South links in Ireland have also been greatly enhanced as a result of EU membership. The single market in Europe has also meant a single market on the island of Ireland, and that's been immensely beneficial for both parts of our country. A UK exit from the EU would mean that the Irish border would overnight become an external border of the European Union, and it is impossible to be confident about the implications that might have for the future. But when I hear people campaigning for the UK to leave the European Union, and I hear them say we want control of our borders, I wonder what that means on the island of Ireland. How can you control that border? Transformation of our economy due to EU membership has also made Ireland increasingly important as a market for British exports. This means that our bilateral relationship, which was hugely asymmetrical in the 1950s and 60s, is now a much more of a situation of mutual advantage, where Ireland is the UK's fifth most important export market, which is a remarkable fact when you consider that our population is just 4.6 million. Now, I know that it'll be argued that the real impact, positive impact on Irish-UK relations has come not from the European Union, but from the Northern Ireland peace process, the success of the peace process. And that's true, of course. But my argument would be that the two things are connected. And I doubt if the mutual confidence required to facilitate the peace process would have come about without the experience that we've gained of working together as partners within the European Union. The first in a series of productive personal relationships at the highest political level between Taoiseach Albert Reynolds and John Major in the early 90s. Their friendship was forged around the ECOFIN table in Brussels when they were both finance ministers. When they became heads of government, they decided to embark upon a course that eventually led, 5 years later, to the Good Friday Agreement. I also know from personal experience the number of times that our Taoiseach and the British Prime Minister over the years met in the margins of European Union summits to exchange views and find agreed ways forward with regard to Northern Ireland during some very troubled times. And the advantage was that instead of having a summit in London or in Dublin under the glare of the media spotlight, they could meet in the corridors or in a small meeting room in Brussels or Strasbourg or Luxembourg or some other European capital where European councils were held. And these were immensely important in facilitating, underpinning the confidence in each other that produced the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement, and the agreements that have flowed from that in the last 15 years. So it's an irony that today, this year, we're commemorating 100 years of Irish history since 1916, that the UK is considering the option of leaving the European Union at a time when we have come closer together than ever before in our history. We worry about the implications of Brexit for British-Irish relations, for North-South links in Ireland, and for Europe. I feel that the damage that would be done to Europe would be very serious from a UK departure, and that would be damaging for Ireland as well, because we have committed our future to the European Union. And we can now see clearly, the British and the Irish, the shared values that unite us. Previously, our somewhat tetchy relationship obscured the things that brought us together. We can now see clearly the shared values that unite us and our European partners. We can also see that those values are not invulnerable. In fact, they are subject to multiple challenges at the moment from various quarters. In our view, these values can best be advanced through concerted action at European level. This is not an easy task because it requires unanimity among 28 member states. Britain has a very different international profile from ours. We're not a member of NATO, but we strongly support the United Nations, and our military specialise in peacekeeping. At the moment, our two navies are working together in the Mediterranean, rescuing migrants from drowning, those who are fleeing from the conflict in Syria. So it seems to me that it makes sense, however appealing unilateral action might be, it makes sense for Europeans to band together in our pursuit of shared objectives rather than going it alone, as I hear people on the Leave side constantly say, in a world in which concerted action will increasingly be required to defend the interests we have in common. There is a sense that Irish-UK relations have come a full circle since 1916, from conflict to cooperation, from friction to friendship. What do we want for the future? We want a continuation of current arrangements, because this seems to us to be the best option. We don't want to see a dislocation in what has become a very productive partnership between our two countries. In a changing world, our affinities are likely to grow rather than to diminish in the future. Whatever happens on the 23rd of June, I am sure that both governments will do all in their power to mitigate any damage to our unique and mutually beneficial bilateral relationship. But it won't be entirely a matter for us. And hard as we may try, there is a risk that those relations will be damaged, will be put at risk by developments in the world following a British exit from the European Union. It's a risk that we think ought to be avoided, and that's why we make these interventions, not because we want to lecture to people in Britain, not because we want to interfere in British affairs, but because we're a neighbour that has concerns, and we would be doing an injustice to ourselves and to our friendship if we remained quiet in the face of the very real concerns we have about the potential impact of this development for Irish-UK relations. Thank you very much.
Okay, my friends, open for questions. I have a name, and I have affiliations as well, please. Yep, one right there, please.
Jonathan Grant from the Policy Institute here at King's. A question and a comment. The question is, it seems to me if we're optimistic and we vote to remain, there's a unique opportunity to recalibrate the relationship with Brussels. How can our friendship with Ireland help us do that? Comment, can we ban the word Brexit and use the word Brin?
Use the word what?
Brin, written in.
Oh yeah, well actually I coined one Remain, but anyway, you will find the hashtag Remain, and the first Remains come from my Twitter account. I'm quite convinced of that. But you can check it if you doubt me. Yeah, sorry, yes, you're right. Well look, as I said in my talk, there is a lot that we have in common. As I also said, we were pretty much the most enthusiastic country around the table during those discussions in Brussels, and the Taoiseach intervened a number of times, I think to good effect, to support the Prime Minister's negotiating agenda. And that tells you something. It tells you that our two countries have a lot in common, and much of that stems from the kind of inherent pragmatism that is a characteristic of British politics and administration, which there's a very similar trend in Ireland. We're not much given, as people are not here, to broad statements of ambition. We're much more inclined to want to make things work properly, and we want to be want to concern ourselves with pragmatic agendas that can make our economy, make our performance better. And I think we have a lot in common. I mean, my own view, for what it's worth, is that the biggest challenge facing the European Union is not the migration crisis, although that is certainly a major challenge and will be a major challenge for some time to come, but it's rather the economic challenge. You know, how does a union like ours, how do our 28 countries manage to make a living in a changing world? I mean, I'm very conscious of this because my experience is of a diplomat who served twice in Asia. Once in 1980 to 83, when Asian economies were no challenge to Europe. I went to China first in 1981, when most people were wearing mouse suits, and the bicycle was the major mode of transport. And there was absolutely no question that China could have had any, pose any threat or any challenge, economic challenge, to Europe in those days. That's all changed now. So I think that where the EU has failed is not that it's over-regulated or that it's not democratic enough or that it's determined to be a European superstate. All those things I believe to be fallacies. I think it's failed because we haven't yet found the recipe between us for a more dynamic economic profile. But we have to find it in a way that also respects the social dimension, which is vital to Europe's future as well, because the characteristic of Europe is that it has economic achievements under its belt, but combined with a rich and elaborate social, health and education system. And to be able to fund those for the future is going to be a major challenge to all of our societies. And I have the view that the best way we can face those challenges is by facing them together. But we need to find the ways of doing that. We need to find the recipes collectively. I mean, I can remember myself in the mid-80s, I was on the policy planning group of the European Union. And in those days, the crisis we were facing was that we were being overtaken by Japan. Nobody ever thought about China, India, Brazil in those days. And actually that process did galvanize a response. And that was all part of what gave rise to the Single European Act and finally, and then the Maastricht Treaty. That was all part of that, responding to an economic challenge. So I think there is an economic challenge now. It's even graver now than it was then. I think we need to galvanise ourselves not to talk about institutions, but rather to talk about how we can work together more effectively to create the kind of dynamism and vibrancy in our economies that will enable us to sustain the kind of lifestyles that Europeans expect and ought to expect for the future.
Thank you. Right.
Ryan Henson, former student of John Davis. I'm glad you raised the issue of sovereignty, and my question is this. How can any democratically elected government fulfil a democratic mandate to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands whilst remaining a member of the European Union?
I talk about prime ministers.
Well, look, first of all, the European Union, although I often hear it referred to in the media here as a bureaucratically driven behemoth, a leviathan, which tramples on democracy. That's not my experience, actually, of the European Union. I mean, every decision of any consequence in Europe is taken by elected people. Now, admittedly, it's not like the Westminster system, because it can't be, because we're not an individual country, we're not a federal country, we're actually 28 different countries. But each decision is taken by the Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers is not populated by bureaucrats, it's populated by people who have an electoral mandate, who are members of their own sovereign governments, and who are authorised by their parliaments to make deals or make laws or contribute to the making of European laws on behalf of their own democratically elected systems. And then, of course, we have the European Parliament, which has an increasing role in feeding into the policy making or the law-making process in the European Union. So, in effect, everything is done by elected people. So, democratic legitimacy is there. But I agree, it needs to be strengthened because of its complexity, and because to explain that means you're losing the argument because it's too complicated an explanation for most people. And people who are used to sovereign states with a parliament and an executive and a people obviously find it difficult to fathom the complexities of the EU. But it is a country that, it is an organisation that is democratically driven, although I accept and I believe that it could be better, and that's one of the things that I know the UK government is keen to do by enhancing the role of national parliaments. And I agree that should be done, and I think it can be done, and I think it will be done in the future, and that will be a very good thing. But national parliaments have to step up to the plate. You know, they have to actually do the work as well to ensure that they have a proper role, the kind of role that's actually allocated to them under the Lisbon Treaty. Now, with regard to migration, well, there are two aspects to migration. There is migration from outside the European Union, which is a matter essentially for national decision, in that, you know, I mean, there are some structures for cooperation, but essentially migration from outside the EU, certainly for those who are not members of the Schengen zone, is something that is for national decision. Migration within the European Union is covered by European Union law, and the Prime Minister, as I understand it, and I think I understand the agreement that was reached in Brussels in February, it seems to me to have been a pretty substantial achievement, but who am I to say, does introduce conditions which I think are designed to stem the flow of immigration, insofar as there are people who are coming here for the purpose of claiming benefit. And I just don't know whether that is a widespread phenomenon or not. So I don't think it's possible to put a number on EU migration into Britain or into Ireland. And in fact, by the way, let me just tell you that the percentage of people in our workforce, in our population, born outside the Irish state, is actually higher than it is in the UK. And yet, in our recent elections in Ireland, not a single politician raised any issue about migration. Now, there may be reasons for that, and I'm not going to get into that because I think you could analyse it in different ways. But I do make the point that we have a much higher percentage, for example, of people from Central and Eastern Europe in our population than is the case here in Britain. And yet, there is no party akin to UKIP that campaigns for a reduction in migration from the European Union. So I make that point for what it's worth. There is no numerical lid you can put on migration within the EU, provided that migration is for the purpose of employment rather than for other reasons which are not covered by the treaties. I think the fact is that most people in Europe do not want to leave their own home places. They do so for a variety of reasons. Irish people come here in large numbers to the UK. Even at times when our economy is doing well, you get a steady flow of people coming here because they want to experience living in a different country. They want to develop their careers in different directions. And that seems to me to be a positive thing. And most of the analysis I see of the impact of migration in Ireland and in the UK and elsewhere is that migration generally has a positive effect on the economic well-being of a country. But of course, there are other things that people might object to when it comes to migration. All I'm saying is that we in Ireland do not have that particular issue as a major bone of contention within our public debate as it currently stands. I'm not saying we never will have it, of course it could happen in the future, I don't know, but for the moment anyway, no political party in Ireland has sought to limit migration from other European countries, or indeed from any country in the world. Yes?
Hi, Daisy Zeblin. I work at the House of Commons. I just want to touch on your answer there. I certainly don't want to labour the point, but obviously you're talking about migration in sort of big policy terms, but obviously most people understand it in a sort of much rawer kind of cultural sense. And from what you said, I got the impression that you think that the politics of migration or immigration in Ireland is sort of friendlier than that of the UK, and I wondered, why do you think that is the case?
Well, I mean, I have my own theory about it, which I have no way of proving. I'm not an expert in this area, but I do think that the fact that the Irish have traditionally seen themselves as a nation of immigrants, of people who went to settle in other parts of the world over the last 150, 200 years, probably has shaped, to some extent, our attitude towards people coming into Ireland. Because there hasn't been any backlash. Even though Polish is now the second most widely spoken language in Ireland, it's overtaken the Irish language as it's now the second most widely spoken language in daily use in Ireland, which is extraordinary because, I mean, if you look at the figures, in the late 90s, the percentage of people born outside the state in our workforce was about 3%. It's now about 15%. And that hasn't generated any particular outcry. I mean, I'm not saying, I think if you talk to people, you probably will find that people have misgivings about some of this stuff, but there's no public space for that kind of attitude to be ventilated, as there is in many other countries around Europe. I think that that in the Irish character there is something of an idealistic sort of, humanitarian sort of left-of-centre strain maybe that militates against. We have plenty of. I mean, we have parties who seek to generate campaigns, but the campaigns tend to be, shall we say, on the left of the spectrum. They tend to be anti-austerity campaigns rather than anti-immigrant campaigns, and most of the anti-austerity parties in Ireland none of them actually has any policy to restrict or eliminate migration or to send home people who are maybe surplus to our province, even though our unemployment rate is 1.5 times the UK rate. We still have 8.4% unemployment, it's about 5.4% here. So even despite that, there's no political space at the moment for anti-immigrant parties. And there's also no Eurosceptic party in Ireland. There are parties who are critical of the European Union, but mainly from the left, like Sinn Féin and the Anti-Austerity Alliance. But they don't actually campaign for Ireland to leave the EU. In fact, Sinn Féin, in the current referendum, in the Bring referendum, which we now call it, will be campaigning for Britain to remain in the European Union. So that's a bit of a turnabout. But there is no party in Ireland that occupies that populist, right-of-centre, Eurosceptic space.
Please.
Hi, Brian O'Connell. I campaign with Irish for Europe. There's a sizable Irish population, first, second, third generation, living and working in Britain, most of whom will have a vote. I wanted to ask you that in the course of your work, you obviously see and meet an awful lot of them up and down the country. What is their general view of what's happening at the moment here in this campaign, in this referendum, and what sort of contribution do you think they could make to that debate?
Well, yeah, I mean, I am obviously in contact with a lot of people from our community, and I'll be doing quite a few events in the coming weeks, responding to requests from the community for information and advice, because many people in the Irish community, just as in the wider community here, will say, I need more information. Someone needs to explain this to me. I don't understand it. And that's, I mean, I'm familiar with that because that happens in Ireland every time we have a referendum. There's always a kind of a sense that there's never enough information. It's always confusing. People are always a bit bewildered. by it, and it creates a lot of irritation and unhappiness within the electorate who find it difficult to access information. So I'm just responding to requests from people within the community to provide them with a view from the Irish government. I'm not saying that view. I mean, the Irish community here is very diverse. It contains every demographic, every social class you could imagine. It's everywhere in the UK, or is everywhere in Britain, and you can assume that their views on these issues won't differ that much from their English-born neighbours. So if somebody has been here since the 1960s, now retired in East London, they're Irish and they still feel very proud of their Irishness, but their attitudes towards many things in the world probably conditioned by the fact that they've lived most of their lives in this country. I hope that they will also bear in mind the Irish angle to this debate that I've tried to bring out this evening and that I bring out in my blogs and tweets. But I think they would be much like the rest of the community here. Possibly they might lean a little bit more in the Remain direction because they'll be aware of the Irish government and the Irish interest in Britain remaining in the European Union. The younger Irish here obviously are in a different category. I had a group of them around the embassy for a debate on this issue only during the week. 150 or so came around, young Irish graduates who are based here in London, and I would say they are probably 100% or close to it in favour of Britain remaining, but that's because they are recently arrived here and they have attitudes that are probably, again, not that much different from their British counterparts, English-born counterparts, except that they've, of course, grown up in Ireland, a country where there's an instinctive pro-European sentiment. Obviously, we're doing what we can. I think the Irish community, as I say, will be swayed to some extent by their Irishness, but not completely. That will not be the only factor. In fact, my sense is that a bigger factor may be what they hear in the environment, which is the same as what the regular English-born voter would hear.
Thank you. My name is Mark Robinson. My affiliation is retired, but I am a former Tory MP, I'm a former government minister, and I'm a former all sorts of other things. And I have an enormous affection for Gareth Fitzgerald, who I met in a bar in Ireland once when we were both on holiday. So that just gives you a bit of background. In my history, I worked, although I was one of Margaret Thatcher's ministers, I worked very closely with Ted Heath, and I hate to tell you this, but I can't find anything in your speech that I can disagree with. That said, I would like to ask you to give us a few comments on the way the campaign is going in this country. David Cameron, at the moment there are just two parties in it. The Tory party for Remain and the Tory party for Leave. Families are split. Boris Johnson's family is split. So is mine. My daughter works for Boris. But, just leave that aside for this moment. What concerns, well, if you and I walked down the street and we started knocking on doors and we started asking people who were members of the EU, I don't think Ireland would get barely mentioned. It might get slightly more than Cyprus, it might get slightly more than Malta, but it would get perhaps barely a mention. If we get onto the issues, well, there aren't any. For Remain, it's migration. For Brexit. Although the most frequently asked questions you ask questions about the referendum. Apparently the most frequently asked question by the British government is, what is this thing called Brexit? On the Leave side, it's Project Fear. But if you talk to people, they say, well, we want to be given reasons why we should leave or why we should stay in. And I am deeply worried about Project Fear because I'm not sure it's winning people over. And the reason I'm deeply worried is that there's no passion on the Remain side but there is plenty of rather misguided passion on the Leave side. Have you any advice, as your country is very good at losing referenda,
winning them.
have you any advice to give us on how we win this one?
Well, given that we've won 10 and lost 2, I think if we win the Premier League, we'd be the Leicester, we'd be the Leicester City rather than the Norwich of the Premier League with that kind of record. Well, I have to say that I do observe the campaigning with great interest, and I speak all the time to people on both sides, so I'm not, believe me, I'm not just talking to people on the Remain side. I've had probably an equal number of meetings with people who would be identified as being on the Brexit side as I've had with those on the Remain side, and I meet others as well, you know, posters and journalists and so on. So I've got a pretty good grasp of what's going on here. I agree with you that a case should probably be made more actively and more assertively for the values of the European Union. Now, I was at the Prime Minister's speech there on Monday morning, and I thought I know it was presented as a kind of the ultimate project for, but actually it was about shared values and so on. And I'm very, as a person who's lived in different parts of the world, I'm very struck by the shared values argument, actually, because even though we might regard people from other parts of Europe as strange and and peculiar, if you go beyond Europe, you quickly realise that there is a European civilization, there is a European set of values which are not always apparent when you go elsewhere in the world. And so my argument for the European Union would actually be that this is the best team that we have for dealing with the things that ought to bother us as countries, be it the security threats in our neighbourhood, be it the situation in Ukraine and the potential for further developments of that kind to trouble the peace of our continent, be it climate change, be it finding the economic elixir of economic dynamism for the future, be it dealing with migration. All these things, it seems to me, can probably only be dealt with by Europeans working together. So I would really like to see that those values, those positive arguments for EU membership profiled more actively in the debate here. But I also remember our own debates, and I know from our own experience how easy it is to paint a dire, catastrophic scenario that seems to be an effective campaigning mode, but it's not a very agreeable one. It's not a very admirable one. But it does seem in Ireland as well. There's a lot of, the campaign very often ends up as, if we vote against this treaty, we'll end up in an economic disaster. That's the sort of narrative that often applies. The other point that I'd like to make from our own experience is that politicians and even business leaders are not always the most popular figures when it comes to a referendum. And we've always found in Ireland that getting people in from different walks of life into a campaign is a very important ingredient. I recognise it's more difficult here because the country is more divided on these issues. People in positions of prominence may be reluctant to come forward. In Ireland, there's a greater willingness on the part of people outside the political world to sort of express a view, because most people are fairly positively disposed towards the European Union. And therefore, it's easier to get people engaged from sectors beyond the political world. But it is, I mean, it's certainly, I certainly look at this debate and I see the risks that it could go either way. I'm hopeful from the point of view of Irish interests and the interests of, that I've talked about, of Irish-UK relations, that it will go for the Remain side, but it's clearly going to be a very tough next 6 weeks for all concerned, and let's see how it goes. But we just offer our opinion for what it's worth. We offer our best wishes, but also our views about the importance of this decision, which I said is a watershed moment for Irish-UK relations, for both of our countries and for the European Union as a whole, because I think the EU could be damaged significantly by a British departure from the Union.
I certainly find it quite interesting that the charge of lack of emotion was also heard over the No campaign for the Scottish referendum. It was all about fear there. Bill, please. I've got two last questions, one there.
Thank you. William Keegan, the Observer and the Strand Group, King's Policy Unit. Dan, has there been any significant increase in applications for Irish citizens from people such as myself of Irish descent?
Well, the answer is there's been some increase in the number of first-time applications for Irish passports from people born in Britain. But I wouldn't say it's convincing at this stage that that's a result of, because the increase is not sufficiently significant, to my mind, to suggest that it comes from one particular source that is a concern about the possibility of the UK leaving the European Union. Of course, we do recognise that the number of people in the UK, in Britain, who would be entitled to an Irish passport could be quite large. And it's an open question as to whether any or what percentage of those people might decide to exercise that option should the UK decide to leave the European Union. But so far, I would say there's no hard evidence of that, although there has been a certain increase in the number of people in that category, English-born or British-born people applying for Irish passport for the first time, suggesting that. But that could be for all sorts of reasons. It doesn't have to be connected with the whole referendum debate.
Yes, please. Right back.
Hello, Conor Sullivan from the Financial Times. The threat level to the mainland UK from Northern Irish related terrorism was raised today. Do you think Brexit would increase the terrorist threat from Northern Irish terrorism to the mainland UK?
Well, first of all, we're talking here about small groups of dissident Republicans who, and the question of whether they pose a threat is not really a matter for me to comment on, because that's a matter that only people in the police and security services can comment on. Our government has repeatedly condemned these people and their activities in Northern Ireland. We would certainly hope that their activities will peter out as they must come to realise that the peace process, which they appear to reject, is the only show in town, and that it's delivering for the people of Northern Ireland, for the people of Ireland as a whole, and indeed for the people of these islands. It's one of the most successful peace processes of the last half century. I don't believe that a Brexit would have direct effects on that sort of security environment, certainly not. As I said in my speech, the two governments will, whatever happens on the 23rd of June, will do everything in their power to ensure that the negative effects are mitigated. And certainly in the security area, I would see the relationship being maintained bilaterally, because that relationship between the Garda, our security services, and the Northern Irish and indeed the British services doesn't actually depend on EU membership. The significance of a possible UK exit from the European Union for Northern Ireland would be more in the economic area, where a very large percentage of Northern Ireland exports go south of the border. They have a trade surplus with us. There's a significant amount of EU funding going into Northern Ireland. The open border obviously is a big advantage to both parts of Ireland. And as I said, the Northern Nationalists probably feel a greater degree of comfort by being part of a wider union with their fellow Irish people south of the border. So those are the things that it will be north-south ties, which will be complicated if there had to be customs controls, for example, as a result of the UK leaving the European Union. The possibility of trade being restricted or hindered in some way. The political relationship between the two countries becoming that bit weaker because they're no longer together every day around those negotiating tables in Brussels and Luxembourg. Those are the things that I think are relevant when it comes to Northern Ireland and the EU referendum, rather than an actual potential increase in security threats.
Thank you very much indeed. That brings to an end the 12th Strand Group meeting. The 13th will take place on the 7th of July, when the Acting Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, John Kingman, in the Treasury, will talk about the Treasury and the supply side. I hope you'll join us for a drink. It's on the first floor upstairs in the chapters room. I suggest taking the left-hand stairs. The right hand is being commandeered by the War Studies people, but take your chances if you fancy. All that's left for me to say, a very big thank you for what I thought was a smashing talk, Dan Mulhall